Well, it's been quite a week. It hasn't even been a week since Russia invaded Ukraine. And it's been a emotional roller coaster ride for those of us who pay too much attention to this sort of thing, and really for everybody else too. It's got a distinctly worried about World War III vibe going on. But there's been a shift recently, and I think this weekend specifically, we've gone from shock, despair, terror into something a little more like resolve. And in some quarters, even a kind of elation, realizing that Europe, NATO, the US alliance more generally is capable of things that it hadn't seemed to be capable of since the Cold War. Putin has done this amazing job motivating a whole range of reactions. And today in this unproduced video, I want to talk about that a little bit, talk about what happened this past weekend, but also try to introduce a note of caution, because we've been here before, twice in my lifetime. We've reached points where the United States seemed sort of unchallengeable and on top and, had the whole world behind it. And in both of those cases, what we saw happen was the United States go too far, or the United States and its allies go too far and expect too much and assume just because there was a momentary flush of support for the United States and our agenda that we could just go infinitely further than that. We saw that at the end of the Cold War, and we saw that after 2001. And in both cases, it eventually led to disaster. So I think it's really important that we look at where we are at now, that we recognize the incredible shifts that have happened over the past week, that we attempt to capitalize on that. I don't just mean as the United States, but as the world in general, that we attempt to capitalize on the changes that have been occurring over this past week, but also that we be very conscious that we can only push Russia so far. This time, the consequences might not be, U.S. humiliation in a financial crisis, or with an overextended NATO, or getting ahead of itself in the Middle East and causing catastrophe there. No, the stakes now are the survival of the human race. Russia is a nuclear country, so we need to actually think a little more consciously about what we are going to do with this momentum that sort of NATO or the US alliance or Europe or whatever seems to have right now. To review what happened this past weekend, there was a lot of doubt in the weeks leading up to Russia's invasion, and during the and in the days directly thereafter. There was a lot of doubt that Europe would be willing, Germany specifically, would be willing to do anything to really counter this. And by this weekend and by Sunday especially, it had become clear that Europe was very, very willing to do things, and to do things in a united front. This is something that I personally didn't think was going to be possible after 2003. But even Condoleezza Rice, George W. Bush's Secretary of State, went on Fox News yesterday to say, wow, Biden really did it. It's extraordinary what he's managed to do. To be clear, the United States and Europe are still buying oil and gas from Russia, which is kind of crazy, but also I think not necessarily a bad thing. But the other steps that have been taken are massive. Germany is rearming. I don't think it'll be something that lasts for years beyond this crisis. Well, hopefully not. But they are tripling their defense budget for this year. They are putting $100 billion into defense spending right now. That's what Germany's doing. They intend to aim for 2% going forward. The German chancellor has committed to not just sanctioning Russia, but to arming the Ukrainians. Honestly, I think we're all being a little too open about arming the Ukrainians, but that is a tremendous shift for Germany. Nord Stream 2, which was this incredibly complicated, contested issue, the pipeline from Russia to Germany, seems now to be suspended. A lot of people are referring to it as dead. I mean, the physical infrastructure is still there. I think that's a little premature, but it has been an extraordinary shift by Germany. The sanctions that have been devised against Russia are some of the most extreme that have ever been put on a country. I think countries like Iran and Syria have dealt with comparable, not the same, but comparable levels of economic destruction due to sanctions. But with an announcement yesterday to today, a financial crisis in Russia, we have gone from essentially zero. There were sanctions on Russia dating back to 2014, their invasion of Crimea and Ukraine back then, but they were, pretty minor. They were sort of those sanctions were so underwhelming. They were the reason why nobody had any faith in Europe today, and they've gone from zero to worse than Iran level sanctions on many sectors of the economy. It's clear, we had images from the Moscow metro where all of a sudden nobody's sort of Apple Pay or Google Pay worked anymore, and everyone's like, what's going on? Everyday Russians don't have access to banking services anymore. This is a tremendous crush on Russia for its actions that Europe was willing to do. Crucially, unlike Obama and Trump, Biden didn't have to do secondary sanctions, didn't have to do this thing where, we say our U.S. nationals aren't going to do business, and also our U.S. courts, our U.S. legal system will go after anybody else in the world who tries to do business with Russia. Almost everybody, with very few exceptions, even China to some degree, I mean, the complexity of it goes back and forth, has decided to just sort of get on board with these sanctions largely voluntarily. This isn't Trump forcing European countries to do sanctions on Iran. This is everybody as a united front. It's honestly, even I, someone who's a real skeptic of NATO quite broadly and believes quite firmly that while Russia's actions are absolutely inexcusable, unforgivable, and are being appropriately punished, I believe that NATO caused this crisis. But even I, yesterday, was just sort of carried away, just being like inspired. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary by some measures. If this doesn't end up with World War III, Joe Biden is like by far the most successful foreign policy president since the Cold War. So like the most successful foreign policy president in 30 years. I don't mean, that doesn't mean he's a good foreign policy president. I loathe his policies on Iran, Yemen, and a range of other things, but he's actually like actively not screwing up the world and actively not making the United States' status in the world dramatically worse. That's unique among post-Cold War U.S. presidents, and that's pretty extraordinary. And yeah, it's something that I, as someone from the United States, I'm still vulnerable to not vulnerable. I consider myself a patriotic American. It's something I'm excited to see and I'm proud of, and it's kind of amazing. It's almost as if George W. Bush had never been president. It's almost like we're finally getting Al Gore's presidency, like somebody who's actually has the sense to realize that there's so much more benefit for the country to be had by organizing allies to actually put together a united front than by going it alone and spinning money for defense contractors, which is everything that we've been doing so far. But this is a real shift in the foreign policy picture of the world that didn't require a drop of U.S. soldiers' blood, and that's something. Of course, the ramifications, the long-term ramifications, are something we haven't even barely begun to understand. And in Ukraine, obviously, there's still a war going on, which I will not have the time to discuss today because we're dealing with other stuff. But I think maybe it's not as apparent to folks, just the extent to which Biden is leading a worldwide coalition against a bad guy. I mean, usually the United States is just, picking on some poor country, murdering a bunch of people. We're kind of the good guys right now. It's kind of amazing. It's really very, very interesting to look at. But we've been here before. We've been at this point where the United States looks both virtuous and triumphant. This was the case in the post-Cold War era, where there was a 1-2 punch of not only, of course, where you date the end of the Cold War is, of course, up for grabs. I mean, Gorbachev was still Even though the Berlin Wall had fallen, Gorbachev was still in power during the first Gulf War, but you had this incredible push behind U.S. power of our main rival sort of being in the process of dismantling itself. And then in the Gulf War, we had a very similar experience of what we've had this past week. A much reviled strongman internationally attempting to invade a neighbor, and Bush went in there with a carefully measured use. This is the first Bush in the 90s, not George W. Bush, with a carefully measured use of force, pushed him out. Still believe that's a good thing. But the problem is that it didn't stop there. We weren't willing to say, look, we did this worthwhile thing with US power. We pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. No, we just never left the Middle East after that. We decided we could spin money by doing no-fly zones in Iraq, by having US fighter jets there all the time, by doing serial bombing of the place, by having sanctions that were maintained to a degree by US military assets, by having US soldiers in Saudi Arabia, which was, of course, one of the main things that motivated the 9/11 attacks. Not to excuse or exonerate that at all. But yeah, the whole Gulf War experience and the fact that the United States went to the Middle East and never left and held on to Saddam Hussein as a punching bag that was useful for foreign policy purposes, and basically just sort of held a reservation on, we're going to go to war with this person eventually. And then Bush's idiot son eventually did go to war with Iraq, creating just incredibly negative consequences. This was at the end of I really am writing a book right now where I talk about just like these are the choices that just essentially murdered utopia. We really could have had just an extraordinarily better place, if better countries, a better world, if the United States had just managed to take yes for an answer and take the extraordinary gift we were given at the end of the Cold War and dismantled our military a bit more, kept the Navy to keep the trade, routes open. We just chose not to. We just chose to double down on militarism, and then it blew back on us in 9/11, and we've spent the past 20 years since 9/11 just playing out that dumb-ass script because we couldn't take yes for an answer. We couldn't accept being the dominant country in a happy, peaceful world. Another example would be the aftermath of 9/11. When that happened, it was like the whole decade of, Clinton's ignoring the world, us starving Iraq to death, which everybody was really angry about in the 90s with our sanctions. That just ended in 2001. We were right back there and everybody loved us. Everybody was Americans now. And our choice to what to do with that was to destroy the Middle East, going after a bunch of countries that had very little to do with 9/11, more or less in service to Saudi Arabia, the country that was most responsible for 9/11, which is just, anyway, that's a whole nother bag of worms. But it was, and I think one of the most evocative aspects of that is that in 2003, this was after we'd already squandered a good deal of goodwill, but we still looked strong because this was directly after we had crushed Saddam Hussein. The Iranians came to us and essentially offered us everything, essentially offered us peace in our time, essentially just said, here's the keys to the kingdom on a platter. We'll try to get Hezbollah to disarm. We'll stop giving money to Hamas. You want to do oil deals here? Just tell us what you want. And the Bush administration was like, nah, we're coming for you. We don't want to deal with you. We're coming for you. And then, of course, famously, Iran, along with Saudi Arabia's proxies too, came for us in the Iraqi insurgency, which went very, very poorly. So what I'm saying is, we're in one of those moments. I can't believe that Vladimir Putin was stupid enough to give us a gift like this, but he did it. He decided to be a poor man's George W. Bush, a poor man's Saddam Hussein, and he gave the United States one of the biggest geopolitical gifts I can imagine. And the question is, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it? Are we going to get even higher on our own supply? Are we going to insist on super maximalist demands? Are we going to... I've seen semi-serious reporters and functionaries in European and US security functions with hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter being like, oh, it's time for regime change in Russia, which is just insane. We are in this weird moment, which is both an extraordinary victory for the United States geopolitically, but is also, I would say, significantly more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we've got folks talking about regime change. No, like the thing to do now is to start the negotiations, is to back Zelensky in his negotiations with the Russians to figure out how we get to an answer. Because I think there are many answers that are available. And the thing is, we have to, in the coming weeks, be more serious about finding an answer, about finding a settlement, about finding peace, than finding another excuse to sell more weapons. Because we've got that. You know, Putin has already guaranteed that everybody in Europe is going to buy tons of weapons from us. We don't need to make this worse. We just need to find a way to find a settlement. It's an extraordinary place of opportunity that the world and the United States are in right now. And it's vital that we choose peace at this moment instead of figuring out how we can push it further. So I think this is an extraordinary moment. This is an extraordinarily dangerous moment. But it's also a moment of extraordinary opportunity. I feel better with Biden there than any other president since the first Bush, but I don't feel great with Biden there. And I think that really as a world, we've got to try to push people more towards sanity than more destruction. Because don't get me wrong, there's more destruction to come. I mean, next week we'll get this storyline of what happens when Russia tries to turn off the oil and gas taps to Europe. And if we don't have a deal between Zelensky and Putin by the time that's played out for a couple of weeks, then yeah, I mean, I think we're getting into really dangerous territory. So anyway, just wanted to just give that note of caution. I think I did 3. I did a produced video and 2 live videos, and in addition, I also had some presentations in other venues last week. So yeah, I don't feel too bad about doing an unproduced video today. Things are obviously developing very quickly. I had half of a produced video that I wrote on Friday, and now it looks like it's from a different world as far as where things are. But by this Friday, it may make a lot of sense again. I just don't know. So things are a little up in the air. I may probably try to go live again later this week. Studying Yemen very intensely. I feel like I just need to talk more about that country. But yeah, don't know what's coming. Hoping and praying for peace. And I hope you'll do that too. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Let me know what you think in comments. Like, subscribe, etc., etc., etc. Thanks.